So, in this short little presentation, we're looking at biodiversity, and in particular, the biodiversity that is threatened. And so, we know that biodiversity is necessary for living things. And as I said before in an earlier presentation, biodiversity is a measure of the variety of species, and it's particularly the genes in that pool within that species. So, the more variety, the more diversity, the better the organisms are. Um, so, high genetic diversity, in other words, the amount of genes that are present, increases the chance that some species, if something devastating comes by, will survive and pass those healthy genes that allow them to survive to the next generation. So, again, we think about disease as one of those, but even global warming that we know is happening now. Some plants, some animals, some insects have particular genes that may be allowing them to survive and thrive in those types of conditions and allows life to persist here on planet Earth. One of the threats to biodiversity, however, is man. And here is just a big swath of land that was cut down in northern Minnesota. And you can see that the tree line there and the roads that are present, you've literally just stripped away all the living things that were inhabiting this particular area. And so mankind in general, is really a threat to the diversity that's should be present within our ecosystems. We have had several mass extinctions before over time. The table indicates those and some of the things that we can find currently that maybe are fossilized, whether that be the trilobites or the dinosaurs. We can see these evidence of the mass extinctions over time. So the gradual loss of these species doesn't just happen overnight, but we are certainly increasing the rate of activity here in what many scientists call the sixth mass extinction. And we're just accelerating that at a much faster time period than it's ever happened in the Earth's history. So, good old Homo sapiens is responsible for that. One example of that is the 1970s. We had millions and billions of birds flying to and from some of the warmer weathers to the colder to the cooler regions and back and forth in the United States. Currently, now we have probably about 30 billion. Has been some estimates, fewer species flying over the pathways that was once populous with these migratory birds. Over exploitations. Now, some of the photos that I'll show you here are a little disturbing, and this may be one, but there are some ones that follow this, and that's some of the excessive use of species for economic gain. And we're talking about human economic gain. So here is a picture of two gentlemen, or actually four gentlemen, in front of some of the buffalo heads that they collected as the white settlers moved from the east to the west coast. And the United States government, unfortunately, was actually encouraging some of the movement and certainly the removal of some of these large herbivores in the Midwest. There was once thought to be around 75 million bison. Many estimates say you couldn't look into a field or a tall grass prairie without seeing it just riddled with movement from these bison. And by the 1880s, there was less than 1,000. And so they were literally exterminated from this planet because the only place you could find these bison were here in the United States. So if we back up to this, the bison, they were once a very numerous and prosperous organism. There was some symbiotic relationships that existed between the Native Americans and the Plains Indians, for example, that they used for food. They used their hides for making teepees and covers and blankets, especially in the Midwest here, where you have some pretty cold and bitter winters that they had to survive. And they were able to do that because of their unique relationship with the buffalo and using those for these different resources. One thing I noted about the Native Americans is they used, when they did kill a buffalo, they used every part, that nothing went to waste. The stomachs were used for water, carrying water. The hides, of course, as I mentioned, were used for their clothing and their shelters. And of course, the meat was dried and used for their consumption at all times of the year. And there was this really unique balance. And one would say that even the wolves provide something very similar. Kept this predator prey type of relationship in check. Um, if we kind of move on here from this, you can see in the next photo of the encouragement from the United States government to rid of the buffalo. The government knew that if they got rid of the buffalo, um, and the dependency the Native Americans had on the buffalo, we would certainly see a shift in the ability of the United States government to move the Native Americans onto reservations. And that's kind of what we're seeing here with this photograph. The encouragement for the white settlers to remove the buffalo, and here's a collection of all those bison skulls that is in excess for sure. So exploitation, as I said, with songbirds, the passenger pigeon was one of those. Used to have flocks that were billions and would sometimes take hours to pass overhead as they're migrating from one location to the next. And as a result of loss of habitat, use for food, they were pretty much became extinct by 1914, at least the current passenger pigeons. Now, continuing on with this idea of over exploitation, if we look at, and this one gets kind of dicey, so you might want to be careful here if you're really sensitive. Poaching is also illegal, but we know that modern man is greedy, and they will use the parts of animals, whether it be from rhinoceros or elephant, for their own purposes. And this is here is a collection of some not skulls, but the tusks from elephants that were collected illegally through poaching. And this next photo is a little bit concerning, so I won't show it for very long. But you can see what happens here with some of this over exploitation of this, and that some of the illegal hunting that occurs is quite disturbing. And again, the rest of the body parts are left for others to deal with, and loss of that species. So habitat loss, I said before, whether it's northern Minnesota or in the Amazon, when we start wiping out the rainforests for farmland or just for the timber, we do lose species and the complexity of that ecosystem. So this deforestation causes one or many types of species to become extinct. There is a lady here that, again, if you go into Wangari Matthias, her movement in the 1970s, kind of has brought full circle this idea of the green belt movement, in other words, preservation of habitat loss, and try to kind of find that balance between some of man or humans' needs and also the needs for biodiversity. Um, so that was one piece. Another part of this is somehow we disturb the habitats that these species live in. I'm talking, of course, about humans. For example, if we were to look at this habitat within the ocean along California, you'll notice several species here. We have fish, a variety of different fish species. We have the krill and other microorganisms that some of the largest organisms in the world feed upon, and these are microscopic organisms. Well, fish also feed upon this. Sea lions feed upon the fish, and this is a nice little food chain. And as we go up here to the killer whales and sea otters, we can see some of the interconnectedness between this. But what happens if all of a sudden we do something as humans and maybe overfish an area for our own needs? What is that going to do to the remaining populations above the pyramid and below the pyramid, if we can think of it that way? Well, when we make some of those changes, maybe because of our own thoughts or greed or needs, we definitely have an immediate impact. And one of these things that's come about is we've used the term keystone species. Keystone species are those like the fish that are used, and if they're somehow removed or reduced, that will dramatically affect how populations interact or utilize the resources at their disposal. So perhaps if the killer whales are dependent on the sea lions, and there's not enough sea lions because they've died as a result of lack of food or habitat, these killer whales might find other resources, other food sources that normally wouldn't be used. And maybe now they're going to start hunting these other sources like sea otters and others that they normally wouldn't. So again, there's a balance that we have to recognize. Um, the other thing that's kind of interesting is some of the what we refer to as habitat fragmentation. Obviously, with the roads that we build and the cities that we build, we're dividing areas of ecosystems where um, the habitat is definitely going to be affected, and the species that live within that habitat sometimes can be pulled apart or separated. So these divisions, like a freeway system, or like I said, or as a city, can act like these barriers, and these barriers lead to potentially lower genetic diversity within the species. I'm talking about plants and animals and insects. Um, and it has, a different effect as a result of even some of the winds that may be able to be more prevalent as a result of removal of something or addition of something. I mean, who would have thought that the desert Southwest, like in Las Vegas, now has meters where you can actually register precipitation and humidity. It's never that we're aware of has happened, and certainly with all the addition of water into, especially Las Vegas, with all the fountains and things, we're dramatically influencing the habitat and the environment within that geographic area. Pollution, another thing that we have to consider here, and pollution is something that is prevalent all over. There is something called a point and a non-point types of pollution. And I want to distinguish between the two. With point source pollutions, you can point to a specific person, company, country, or for the particular cause. This, you can see, is pretty evident with these pipes sticking out and the pollution that's going to be emanating from those. That's a point source pollution. Usually it's from some type of business or homeowner as a result of some of their operatings, and they're dumping their pollutants typically into a river. That's very common worldwide. So these water pollutions by septic tanks, especially in Minnesota, this is some of those would point to this as a point source pollution um, uh, that we need to address. So in Minnesota, for example, we have about 50,000 straight pipes that are dumping their sewage and waste products into lakes or streams. That's a lot of feces and urine going directly into the lakes that we're fishing from and getting some of our resources from, whether that be recreational or food supplies. Global warming causes and effects. This is certainly some of those non-points, and there are many contributing problem or things to this particular problem. Global warming, hole in the ozones, both north and south poles, some of the ocean plastics, all are a result of what we refer to as the non-point. This is again many contributions, not just one single aspect, that are contributing to global warming and some of the gases up in the atmosphere. I'm going to blow through this a little bit and just get to this point. This is a good example in American history as far as pollutions and what's happened to some of our American icons. For example, back in the 60s and earlier, we were using a chemical called DDT, and DDT was sprayed to reduce the insects in and around an area, and it did a really effective job. So if we look at some of it's a chemical that destroyed these insects. Well, if these insects all of a sudden that were killed landed in the rivers, streams, fish would consume those almost like easy prey, and those elements of that are poisonous. And what we get is a magnification. In other words, as the fish here in this model are consuming these insects that were sprayed with a harmful chemical, um, the more and more insects they got, the more present that chemical was within their tissues. Now, if you have larger fish consuming several smaller fish, you can see the amplification or the magnification that would occur. Two or three fish a day, all of a sudden you're getting a higher and higher concentration within that larger fish's body tissues. And in the end, if you have something like a bald eagle, and within it's consuming maybe several fish, the amount of toxins and chemicals that's found in that DDT was found present in the bald eagles. And what eventually happened was that it didn't necessarily kill the adult eagles, but what it did have an effect on is when they laid their eggs, the eggs, as a result of the chemicals present in DDT, um, made the eggs that house the embryos really soft. So when the adults would come down and sit on the eggs to keep them warm and fertilize them, or for the development of those, they would crush them. So early on, we had a major catastrophe, and this is a source of a point source type of contamination with a chemical and having large effects within the food chain. And again, it began pretty small with just insects, but it's certainly very quickly magnified into a population that affected some of the larger vertebrates and secondary and tertiary consumers. So pollution, whether it's pollution from factories or cars, certainly gets up in the atmosphere. One of the challenges we've had here in Minnesota is some of the pollutions from Canada going up into the atmosphere and then raining down on our lakes, not only in Canada but also in Minnesota, and changing the pH of those lakes, and they became more acid. So, as the pH changed in those rivers and lakes in northern Minnesota, the clarity became much, much better. Unfortunately, it killed off some of the microbes, those young plants, and even some fish couldn't handle the change in the pH as a result of becoming more and more acidic. And that's just all by as a result of burning some of these fossil fuels, which again can come down in different forms of pollutants in the form of acid rain. Um, the Some of the last little things here is a picture of eutrophication, and eutrophication occurs when we have these fertilizers, and there's a limit as far as what's necessary for a population to keep it in check. And when we have fertilizers that are producing or releasing much more than necessary into a land and it washes off into our area, rivers and lakes. Think about the lakes down in Minneapolis, where you have a chain of lakes that sometimes in the end of July and certainly early August, you have these huge algae blooms. Well, that's a result of some of the fertilizers that we're spraying onto our um, lawns and grasses to maintain those, or even some of the golf courses, and we're adding extra nitrogens and phosphates that really allows those organisms to just take those primary producers just to take off and overproduce the amount number of cells and organisms that would normally live comfortably within that area. And that's all result of some of these pollutions that we're contributing. And usually, like I said, we wouldn't do this on purpose, but these are some of the effects. So these large algae blooms not only have created this thick scum on top here, but also chokes out the oxygen, kills the fish, and it really limits what can grow in and around that area for that time period. Another part here is in some of these species, some what we refer to as these invasive species. Now, these are kind of interesting. Here is a picture of an invasive species, kudzu, that has invaded the American South east area. If you go down in some areas of Alabama and Mississippi, you'll find this plant that's almost like a hedge and growing all over. And literally, it was transplanted there as kind of an ornamental plant, but it's just taken off because it's not growing in its natural habitat, and so nothing's keeping it in check. And if nothing's keeping it in check, it's got all these resources, and it just blossoms. Now, this isn't the best example for us to look at here in Minnesota. Some of these others, you've heard of the emerald ash borer. It's originally from Asia, and now it's having devastating effects on our forest systems here in Minnesota. Barrels in some of these ash trees and destroys them. And really, the only way to keep them in check is with the cold weather. And with global warming, of course, our weather temperatures, our average weather temperatures are increasing and not keeping these ash borers in check like they maybe would have happened otherwise. Here's one from Southeast Russia, and this is the zebra mussels that you may be attentive to. Zebra mussels will clog, and they have small little shells. They break up in small little fragments, almost like pieces of glass. If you were to step on them in your lakes or rivers that we've come to frequent here in Minnesota, these are very, very troublesome and very difficult to get rid of. But these are an invasive species as well. Um, Invasive species like Eurasian milfoil, you might have unclogged some of your, if you're a boater or a fisher person, you may have seen these just, again, out of control. This is another example of that invasive species. Those flying carp that you've heard so much about, they're also referred to as Asian carp. They don't belong here in Minnesota, and we're concerned about them making their way up the Mississippi. And we've, again, been battling species like this to keep them in check so that it doesn't affect our recreational opportunities in Minnesota. But these would certainly flourish and have flourished as a result of lack of competition. Um, Conserving some of the biodiversities, we've shown some of the benefits of non-renewable resources such as these fossil fuels. We have to find alternatives. And wind turbines here are one such source. Some of these rely on some of our new technologies that's being developed. Some of the geothermal heat, in other words, from the earth, and some of the solar powers. We've seen a lot more solar panels, certainly in the metropolitan area here in Minneapolis. Some of the wind solar turbines more towards the western and southwestern Minnesota. Certainly, we've seen an increase in their use and availability to help combat this biodiversity problem. Certainly, sustainable use for our products like our natural resources of timber, and making sure that when we do take them down, that they're replaced double as a result of immediately afterwards. And that's kind of what our USDA is about. Is if we have companies, our timber industry is dependent upon some of the influences of USDA in the ag departments and the Forest Service to make sure that we're replanting the trees and so for future generations. And bottom line is we need to reduce our consumption of these and recycle and to help protect these different ecosystems that we love to brag about that's here in Minnesota. So, in a nutshell, here, if we're trying to protect biodiversity, looking at some of the hot spots throughout the world, we know that there are many plants and animal species that are in jeopardy, and they're in constant threat. And if you look at along, especially along the equator here, we can see many of these with populous areas, whether it's South America, North America, some of the rainforests of Africa. There is some of these hotspots where we are concerned about the loss of species and biodiversity. So conserving some of these, some have come to be very unique in their adaptations, like creating habitats or corridors across freeway systems or under freeway systems. If you look down below here, I thought that was kind of a unique way of allowing organisms to have like a little mini highway themselves without the concern or without the threat of some of our transportation autos and trucks. You can see some of the organisms that have been hit and or died as a result of some of those collisions. Um, the restorative ecosystems, we know that the monarch butterfly, we've heard stories about this from elementary school, is that we have a corridor and they're very, very susceptible to some of the things that have some of the technologies and lack of diversity. Well, we know that the monarch is dependent on the milkweed. And so we've created a milkweed highway, this area in green, that's trying to provide the necessary resources for monarchs that inhabit in a small little area down in the Mexico along the Gulf Coast, so that as they emerge from the springtime and move to their winter or their summer feeding and reproductive grounds, they have the resources that are available to them, and that's really important to maintain some of that biodiversity. We just have to go the extra step. Um, Conserving some of this is found in Medicine Lake. We know that some of the rain gardens and some of the other elements that these rain berms that, like they're in yellow here on Medicine Lake, providing a distance between the runoff, so that it can be broken down by fungi and bacteria and other plants, detoxified in another sense before it gets into our riverways and our lake systems. So this bioremediation are just using some of these natural resources to make sure and ensure that any chemical waste that gets away from some of our technologies like automobiles um, gets hopefully somewhat broken down before it enters into our valuable waterways. Um, the other augmentations that we can see is returning some of these predators back to their natural ecosystems, whether you're looking at the timber wolf or the American wolf back in Yellowstone, or even the ladybug that was, kind of reintroduced to control some of the aphids problems. Those are all ways that we're increasing and conserving some of the biodiversity within our ecosystems. All right, we'll end it there. Peace.